In the 19th century, individuals who wanted to study medicine often had few options for formal study, with only a handful of schools accepting students. This meant that most of those who came to Kentucky to teach at places like Transylvania were not from the state. Join us today for a discussion with a scholar who has written an article about the pioneer professors of Kentucky medicine, as we explore the pages of Kentucky history with Kentucky Chronicles. Hi, I'm Daniel J. Burge, the Associate Editor of the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, a scholarly journal and publication since 1903. Those interested in browsing back issues of the Register and reading many of the articles that we talk about here on the podcast should check out Project Muse. Through Project Muse, members of the Kentucky Historical Society are provided with access to past issues dating to 2010. I also coordinate our Research Fellows program, which supports researcher visits to our campus from around the world. Dr. Christopher Willoughby is an assistant professor of African American and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. He holds a PhD in history from Tulane University. He is the author of Masters of Health, Racial Science and Slavery in U.S. Medical Schools. He is a co-editor of the collection Medicine and Healing in the Age of Slavery. He is here today to talk about his article in the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, which is entitled Pioneer Professors of Kentucky Medical Education and the Spread of Racial Science, 1792 to 1861. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So early in the article, you noted that scholars have tended to focus on the Atlantic and have largely ignored how medical ideas moved west into the American interior. Before we delve into the article, can you explain a little about the medical situation in the United States in the late 18th century? If one wanted to study medicine, where did you most likely study?
So that's a great question. So the Atlantic world focus is important for understanding the history of medicine in this period and is a logical choice, but what ends up happening is we leave off this Western history. So for much of this period, really the whole 18th century, there are very few outlets for medical education in the United States. How most physicians would have trained would have been through apprenticing with a local physician. So what this meant was you might literally kind of write out prescriptions for the doctor, clean their office, while reading a textbook, getting instruction, and witnessing them perform medical practice in usually rural contexts. So this was the most common way that physicians train. But in the second half of the 18th century, in the Northeast, there will be three medical schools founded. The first is what's now the University of Pennsylvania's medical school, and that's founded in 1765 by a couple of physicians who trained at the University of Edinburgh. Second, in 1767 is Columbia University's medical school, which was called the College of Physicians and Surgeons of New York. And then in 1783, right after the Revolution, Harvard's medical school was founded in Boston. And for the rest of the 18th century, for the most part, this is it. Only a little more than 200 MDs are produced in the US in the 18th century. And then a small cohort of influential physicians also traveled to Europe, traveled to Edinburgh, and trained there. And there, they were learning essentially, and really the last cohort of physicians to do so, learning a kind of humoral medicine. So all diseases are caused by your bodies in states of unbalance. I mean, there's a lot more nuance to it, but by the 19th century, people will start looking for kind of specific anatomical appearances of disease. But in this last period of the 18th century, they're really still in a humoral medicine framework. So the reason why there was such an Atlantic focus is because of the influence of Edinburgh and the European schools and their alumnus founding medical schools in the United States. But what it has left out is how these ideas travel west. And many of the physicians I study will train under Edinburgh-trained physicians at the University of Pennsylvania.
That's an interesting point. We had Joan Cashin on, and we talked to her, and her article focuses on Ephraim McDowell, who is trained at Edinburgh. So he sort of has the direct connection. He comes, from there. So a good chunk of our talk was about sort of that connection and why people go to Scotland to train. So that's interesting. So a good chunk of the article revolves around Charles Caldwell and Daniel Drake. Now, I'm hoping our listeners will read the article itself. And given time constraints, can you talk a little bit about Drake and sort of how he ends up coming out to Kentucky? What can we learn from studying the career trajectory of a physician like Drake?
So Drake's a really fascinating figure for reasons that were enough to write almost a whole article about him. And I'm still very interested in him. But he is actually a Westerner in the sense of, and certainly identifies as a Westerner. Kind of biography or kind of collection of writings put out by his ancestors later calls him a pioneer professor, a pioneer physician. But so he's born in Cincinnati, raised in Cincinnati, will in some ways captures a lot of different aspects of what we just talked about. He'll
Right.
first apprentice with a Penn graduate who works with Benjamin Rush, who was a founding father, Declaration of Independence signer, and probably the most influential physician in early America. Drake will then go to the University of Pennsylvania, and over two stints, he'll study with Rush and ultimately get his degree in 1816 after Rush's death. And then in 1819, Drake comes back to Ohio, helps found the Medical College of Ohio in
Right.
Cincinnati, which does not really exist anymore, but it has a pretty long career and existence in the antebellum period. But so he'll be switching back and forth in a lot of his career, and sometimes, from what I gather, teaching simultaneously in Cincinnati and in Kentucky. And how they did this was they would teach in one term during the summer in one state and during the winter in the other state. And this was a good way to make money, as being a medical professor in this time period was not as lucrative as you might expect, even though these are still pretty elite figures.
Were you
Uh,
paid based on students? I know that might be is that how it
no,
worked back in the day, that you were paid based on the number of students you had?
that's a great question. Yeah, so they actually issued admission tickets to their lectures. And so each professor would get paid based on their number of students. And so it was not so uncommon during this period. And Drake did this in Pennsylvania his first time, to study only select classes and not seek a degree. So you might study just with Drake and Caldwell and not take the rest of the classes. Drake and Charles Caldwell, another physician I write about in this essay, as a way of saving money, but it might mean that some professors, their practice or their educational practice is more lucrative than some of their colleagues. So yeah, and so Drake ends up in the early 1820s at Transylvania University's medical school, which is the first medical school in Kentucky, and it's in Lexington. Still a liberal arts college there today, has amazing archives, which I use in this article. And in 1837, just to give one last little bit on him, he and several other faculty members will splinter from Transylvania University and end up founding what's still today the University of Louisville's medical school. So he's a critical figure in the origins of medical education in Ohio and in Kentucky as well. And I think Drake's career can tell us a couple of really important holistic points about the nature of medicine in the West in this period, in the South, and what we might even call regional medicine in this era. So, in that late 18th century period, there's a slow but important institutional development in the northeastern United States. But the West, and really the kind of larger, we'll say, Mississippi Valley,
Mhm.
is totally bereft of medical institutions. There's, a hospital in New Orleans. There might be some kind of almshouse hospitals in larger towns and cities. But for the most part, there's no real center of institutional medicine. It's in the hand of local doctors, and training is in the hand of apprenticeships. So Drake is an important figure in establishing an institutional basis of medicine in the West, in the what's also in this period called the interior of the country, which tells you something about the primacy of the eastern states. But so these folks, yeah, as I said earlier, self-identify as kind of pioneers, but certainly are Western settlers, and I think would probably be a more neutral term for the 21st century. And what this rapid institutional development, and we should also note that Drake founds the Western and Southern Medical Recorder, which is a medical journal for the West. But this rapid institutional development allows for an increasingly coherent medical profession in the region. So when you have apprenticeships, every doctor really could have a quite different way of viewing medicine. after this period, you'll have physicians trained by the same set of professors, the same figures. They'll go out and found medical schools. So Benjamin Rush in Philadelphia influences Drake and other physicians who found the institutions in Kentucky and Ohio, but also in South Carolina and Louisiana. So they're kind of spreading medicine out into the interior, into the southern up states, and will create an influential medical profession. Shouldn't be that surprising to us, but Cincinnati, just across the border, will be the site of the third meeting of the American Medical Association in 1850. And Daniel Drake will be a critical organizer. He'll receive a very influential physician, John Collins Warren, who's an anatomy professor at Harvard, the first physician to conduct a surgery with a patient under anesthesia, who founds the New England Journal of Medicine. He'll come and go to church with Drake in Cincinnati during the AMA. We'll visit him. We'll go see their skull collection. So Drake ends up also being this sort of ambassador for the West, and will use his connections to the East to influence national politics, which I'll talk about potentially later.
No, the skull collecting thing gave that's still just so creepy, but at the same time, it was really interesting that they did it, which I'm sure we can get into a little bit.
Yeah.
Once these men were established professors in Kentucky, what types of theories were they embracing and or helping to create? So can you perhaps explain to our listeners why some of these theories that they were creating was so significant at this time?
So Drake and Charles Caldwell, who is roughly, he's a little bit older than Drake, but they die at almost the same time. But their careers really overlap in Kentucky, and so they're kind of worth thinking about together in certain ways. And they also both study with Benjamin Rush at the University of Pennsylvania.
Okay.
So Drake and Caldwell in particular, will be in Philadelphia in the 1790s when there's a massive yellow fever epidemic. People have written about it ad nauseum.
Right.
But Caldwell will himself get involved in these debates. And in this time period, there's a theory that African Americans are immune to certain diseases, immune in particular to yellow fever, or if they get yellow fever, it's less virulent. Benjamin Rush teaches his students at the University of Pennsylvania that, like, literally black skin color is a form of leprosy that doctors should cure, which is quite racist, even though Rush was actually an abolitionist. So in some ways, you could say Rush is the most probably racially progressive person from a white elite that
Mhm.
we would be talking about in this podcast, but also has quite racist beliefs. But Caldwell and Drake will really emerge in a period that's marked in American science, and as I argue in my book, in American medicine, by a debate over polygenesis and monogenesis. And to quickly just give a overview of what these theories are. So monogenesis would be, in its most simple explanation, the biblical understanding of human origins and racial difference to some extent. So in that all humans come from a single origin, mono being singular, genesis being origin, and in a kind of traditional Christian worldview, this would be Adam and Eve. Racial differences, to the extent that they're meaningful, are acquired over time in different environments, perhaps different kind of social experiences. So this is someone like Rush. His version of racial difference as a form of leprosy is idiosyncratic, but the idea that race is not necessarily permanent fits in a older monogenesis framework. Polygenesis and polygenes begin to emerge during the Enlightenment primarily, although they have some older figures, and they argue that human difference has separate origins. So each racial group, and in most cases, there's a lot of diversity and disagreement amongst these scholars, but we'll say the mainstream, most common thing was there were 5 races with 5 different origins. And generally speaking, that these different races are different species. And so, on one extreme, in the way this was described, these are not my terms, of course. On one extreme would have been white people at the top, which to some extent would have included people like of kind of Arab descent, even into the Caucasus, Europeans certainly. So these borders are kind of confusing in this time period and how they think of them. But certainly Turkish people would have been included in that. So parts of the Islamic world. And then you had East Asian, Southeast Asian, or like Southeast Pacific Islander, like so what they would call Malays, and then you had Native Americans were, of course,
Yeah.
another race, and then people of African descent. And Native Americans and people of African descent were usually the bottom two groups in in these almost always ranked way. So these emerge out of Enlightenment classification schemes. Carolus Linnaeus, the first kind of inventor of binomial nomenclature, Homo sapien is an example of that, will group racial groups separately in the first half of the 18th century. But in the antebellum period, when we're in this moment of kind of tearing the country apart for 40 years, mind you, it's not something that happens overnight. This debate over racial origins becomes more important as the debate over slavery becomes more important. So somebody like Caldwell is a pro-polygenist. He's the first American to write a book, like a full book. There are other people to write articles, but a full book in defense of polygenesis. Drake, on the other hand, is not a polygenesis, but he is not a believer that racial changes can change quickly. So that's a difference between antebellum monogenes and earlier monogenes. So somebody like Drake would argue that, kind of civilizing other
Mhm.
racial groups. I'm putting some on a podcast, so I should remind myself, scare quotes, quote unquote, civilizing, not other groups, would take thousands, perhaps millions of years. Like these changes, they would argue, took place over a much longer time period. So it's not like Benjamin Rush, who argues, with some copious bleeding and potentially kind of rubbing people down with different oils and limes, you might be able to find a way to kind of cure the leprosy of blackness. It's racial differences can only be solved by a kind of, what we might think of in the second half of the 19th century, a white man's burden civilizing mission, a long, long time frame for that to happen. So he ends up sounding a lot more like a polygenist in any sort of pragmatic political way than a monogenist would in the 18th century. There's not a lot of optimism for ending racial difference. Not that that's something we necessarily want today, or like, our kind of cultural differences, but that will shift in this period, and they'll be important figures in kind of shifting that discourse from the more Enlightenment to the antebellum.
Just as sort of a side question, within a state like Kentucky, is the reception to these theories that are coming out, are average Kentuckians aware that these things are being taught at Transylvania, or is this more of a dissertation or a thesis, and these are more scientists or individuals at medical school arguing with each other? Is there sort of an, I don't know, acknowledgement within the larger community that they're challenging,
So,
monogenesis and these types of things?
yeah, so that's a great question. So what's very interesting is there is a sense, it's hard to say what for lack of a better word, like a non-literate farmer in a rural space might. I mean, I
Mhm.
think by the getting close to the Civil War, this stuff was to some extent in popular discourse. And you
Yeah.
might even hear about it in a sermon, but most likely against polygyny. So a church-going person might
Yeah.
hear about it. And the truth is, what's kind of interesting is that despite the South being so, in this period, virulently white
Mhm.
supremacist, imbibing in a kind of way of understanding slavery as a positive good for people of African descent, which obviously is, from a present perspective, nuts. And so, like, you'd think that a theory that says black people are a different species, it says they're actually built for working in this environment, which I can get into a bit more in another context, but that in every way is kind of formed to justify slavery through science, would have more popular credence, but it really doesn't. Most people find it blasphemous. So for the average Kentuckian, it's probably a blasphemous theory. But for the average Kentucky physician, I think more and more it's something that they're aware of, they've talked about, they've thought about. and certainly by the end of this period that I'm studying, by the Civil War, and it would increase over time. They would know and have an opinion. And probably this is impossible, just speculative. I would not be surprised at all if a majority of them were polygynous. But I would also not be that surprised if the majority weren't. But I've seen in letters, not in Kentucky, but a physician I track in Alabama in my book, who, and I actually start the book this way, writes to his father, who's in South Alabama. And this young man is studying at the University of Pennsylvania and had studied at the University of Pennsylvania and wrote an article in defense of polygenesis and sends it to his dad, who's a very influential planter. And he circulates it to the physicians and asks them for their opinions on it. And the dad says, to my mind, this is blasphemous. But Dr. X says he agrees with it, and Dr. Y is reading it with interest. And so I think in medicine, this is viewed as like the kind of new secular science because it does challenge a kind of, we might almost think of a traditional kind of religious perspective. And so there's a kind of armor of enlightenment and advancement that comes with embracing this secular, even though it's of course based on a religious premise of creation as well, but this more secular scientific theory. Polygenists in general are more inclined to accept a longer timeline of the Earth than 6,000 years, and are in some ways. Some historians of science have said that they kind of open up the door for the challenge of Darwinism before Darwin publishes on the origin of the species. And I think there's some credence to that. So a lot of physicians who wanted to fashion themselves as elite, urbane, international types, polygenesis was one set of theories that you could kind of adopt to be a progressive scientist in a certain way. Obviously not progressive politically, but progressive in the sense of challenging what the boundaries are of knowledge, of what we know about humanity and our human history, which is being challenged deeply in this time period. There's already another theory of evolution that's very popular in France by called Lamarckian evolution, and Darwin will publish his theory just a few years after the death of Drake and Caldwell.
Now, I was just curious about that because I was thinking we can look at all these different, sort of scientific ideas that are spreading, but I was just curious the extent that that would have infiltrated sort of the state at large, which does lead me nicely into the next question, which is Kentucky is a difficult state to define in the antebellum era. We talked about this a little before we went on air. It was a state that held a large enslaved population and that is yet seen by most at the time, mid 19th century, as being part of the West. How did Kentucky's position as a Western, and I have that in quotation marks, slave state influence men like Caldwell? I was particularly interested in how Drake used scientific theories to justify colonization and a push for a whiter, as they put it, a whiter West.
Yeah, and it is still, I think, a very interesting state. I had the pleasure of doing research in Eastern Kentucky for my dissertation and book, and this article, of course. And then I also, my partner she was a professor at Murray State University for several years. So I have some roots in the state. And I always feel like people in Murray very much identify as Southerners. You're 10 miles from Tennessee, literally. And on the other hand, I had a good friend in college from Louisville who always was like, we're the Midwest. I don't know how everybody in Louisville feels about it, but that's how she always identified. And so I think it still has that kind of, where does this state fit? I'm sure for people in the like kind of Confederate memory crowd, it's like, where does this border state fit as well? So it's a very fascinating state. And what also I think is interesting, and I want to try and make sure I'm coherent here, but I think border states and upper South states also expose the contradictions of a lot of racial theories. So someone like Drake did not see slavery in the South, which included, to his mind, Kentucky, as unhealthy, but believed it was unhealthy for free African Americans to move to Ohio, the Midwest. So, literally what separates them is one physical border. He's a guy from Cincinnati teaching a lot of his career in Louisville. These are places that are, roughly speaking, climatologically identical. So what the kind of how they use this was a part of polygenesis and this idea, and this is why I would say that even the monogenists in this period, like Drake, are in a lot of ways seem more like polygenists. So polygenicists argued that each race not only had separate origins, but that these origins, these creations, suited them for specific climates. So people of African descent in this, theory are built for tropical climates. So a place like, the Caribbean, this kind of has some logic to it, but then you have to extend to Kentucky subtropical status, which it is very humid there, but I don't know if I would call it the subtropics either. So they argued that climate was bad for enslaved people, bad for people of African descent in Ohio, and yet that he never seems to challenge the legality of slavery in Kentucky. And what Drake's ultimate position is that he is a what's called a colonizationist. And so if you don't know, colonization is this kind of scheme that emerges in the early 19th century. And the idea is, and it maybe seemed somewhat plausible at that point when the enslaved population was closer to 1 million people at the turn of the 19th century. I don't have these numbers in front of me, versus over 4 million in the
Mhm.
1850s. But that you would put all of the enslaved people on boats, give them freedom, and send them to Liberia. Eventually, that's like the specific plan. Liberia is a kind of American and British colony in this period. And the idea, though, is that Drake says that colonization is critical to creating a wider West, and that he wants to actually pass laws that ban free enslaved people. So an enslaved person gets manumitted. In a lot of cases in the South, if you get manumitted, you couldn't stay, especially later in the antebellum period in these states. And Drake wants to ban African Americans from being able to come to Ohio and other northern states, I should say. And Indiana actually does this. I think they're the only state that does a complete ban on free people coming to their state. But so this whole set of theories, these ideas that African Americans are sicker in cold climates, have higher rates of lung and pulmonary ailments, like particularly tuberculosis. They also argue that African Americans might go insane in the climates of the North. There are medical students at the Medical College of South Carolina who make this case I discuss in my book. And somebody, Transylvania graduate, Samuel Cartwright, often kind of considered the kookiest of the racial theorists, even came up with this idea that enslaved people running away were mentally ill rather than hating slavery. Drake uses these racial theories to justify, theoretically, I don't know if he really thinks it's possible, because it seems to me in 1851, when he writes a series of articles that go in the most influential Whig newspaper in the United States, the National Intelligencer, arguing that people of African descent need to be banned because it's unhealthy for them to go to the North, and that slavery kind of needs to be preserved until we can send everyone to Africa, because slavery is the only system of managing this, and these are, of course, Drake's words, unruly population. And so colonization is the kind of justification. But I think also realistically, what the real questions, when there's not a satisfactory answer to them, is what did Drake really think would happen? It's hard to say. People have been talking about colonization by 1851 for at least 30 years, really probably more like 40, 50 years. But there had not been a significant, the slave population in the US had grown fourfold by this point. There's no real sense that slavery is going to end naturally or passively. So, what we make of that, I certainly wouldn't call Drake any meaningful way an opponent of slavery,
Mhm.
but rather what I think his kind of biggest fear is a loss of whiteness in the West. And so colonization, I think, in some ways becomes, we're kind of psychoanalyzing here, the excuse. And colonization, yeah, is the excuse to say we have a better scheme that's
Mhm.
anti-slavery that we'll do in some future unknown date. But for now, the important thing is to confine Black people out of the North and in the South. And that professor I think I mentioned earlier, John Collins Warren, who's at Harvard, actually facilitates the publication of these letters, and they actually happen in response to a series of riots to help free an enslaved person after the Compromise of 1850 in Boston. And Drake kind of writes his friend to see how he's doing and complain about the kind of uprisings that are happening in the really fractious period of the 1850s.
Yeah, well, that was an interesting piece to me because I was somewhat familiar with sort of the Midwest example of trying to ban Black immigration or migration into the state. But Kentucky's such a big, or at least a lot of your prominent Kentucky enslavers, some of them, I should say, not all of them, but many of them do sort of embrace colonization as this sort of, we'll kick the can down the road. Henry Clay most famously, but I think for some of them, it's kind of that, oh yeah, one day we can deal with this, but it's down the road. But to an extent where someone in Louisiana is probably not going to even tinker with that idea, where someone in Kentucky and sort of the upper South is, maybe.
Yeah, and it's their relationship to it is, it's probably closer to what Virginia's was,
Mhm.
where
Yeah.
their land is not, they're not going through a sugar or cotton boom. Their most valuable commodity they're producing are more enslaved people to potentially sell south. And so their framework is a little different.
So, reading this article, I was intrigued by how you use sources. We talked with Joan Cashin about the lack of sources that she had when she did her study of Ephraim McDowell. One of those reasons was he rarely wrote anything, so she had almost no letters from McDowell. Can you tell us a little bit about the sources that you were able to find and sort of how you use them to tell this story?
Yeah, and so one of the benefits of the two central figures of Drake and Caldwell is they're
Mhm.
two of the most prolific authors of the period, and also wrote. They edited journals. They wrote their own autobiographies, which both kind of or both had sort of autobiographies and various certain forms of memoirs that people were able to cobble together. And so they're fairly easy in some ways to capture. But what's always important to me is to show dissemination and adoption of these views by other people. And so one of my favorite sources, and it's been central to my research up to this point, is medical student dissertations.
I was
And
going to ask about that because I noticed you used a lot of them, but I was wondering if that was somewhat unique or if that was something you sort of you fell into as you were going because you cite a lot
so
of them.
so yeah, other people have used medical dissertations before, but I would say I'm the scholar who really became addicted. So for
It's a good
my
idea. It's a good idea.
Yeah. For my book, I read at the University of Pennsylvania, they have a little more than 2,200 theses from the antebellum period. At the Medical College of South Carolina, they have around 1,800. And then at Transylvania University, I didn't sadly get to read all of them, but they have around 2,000 there. So I looked at in total close to 4,300 dissertations, a couple hundred from Transylvania. And they are very fascinating sources. First and foremost, we should not think of them as a modern kind of doctoral dissertation. They're
Okay.
very short, they're about 20 pages. They're closer to a senior thesis, and they're terrible, like very poorly written. They're in this time period, well, really more in the second half of the 19th century, they begin to phase them out. But for much of medieval history, the thesis was the final project of graduating medical school.
Mhm.
And through the early modern period, so through the first half of the 19th century, they were. In the late 19th century, they stopped having to be in Latin and they started to be able to be in English. And they're derivative. They're really like a student saying, so let me read everything I can on yellow fever, and I'll tell you what the modern treatment is of yellow fever. If I've encountered it, maybe I'll give a case study of my own. And so they're often very derivative. Sometimes they're literally, I mean, this is according to professors, plagiarized. Samuel Gross, who was a professor at the University of Louisville for some time, and then went on to Jefferson Medical College, which is in Philadelphia and is almost as lucrative a position as the University of Pennsylvania.
Mhm.
He actually, in a book on the history of medical literature, suggested burning medical student dissertations every spring, every 4th of July coming up, well, when we're recording for the holiday, because they're just so bad. But what that tells you as a historian is you're not really getting somebody's original insights.
Mhm.
You're getting what they learned in class, what's available in their school library. Transylvania University had a pretty big library. They still do in their archives, which makes it a pretty unique, kind of rare book collection of medical history.
And so it's very insightful into the mainstream of medical thought during the period. And one of the group of sources that I focused on are a series of dissertations on what's called Cachexia africana, which is a combination of pica, which is like dirt eating caused by malnutrition, and tuberculosis. Like that's like really what I would say the symptoms that they describe present as. And it's believed as a disease that is not entirely a racial disease in the sense that white people, students argue, can get it, but it's incredibly rare. Almost entirely a disease of people of African descent, according to these students. And so what ends up happening is, I think, with a lot of these kind of specialized diagnoses, is you justify through creating a disease a certain set of problems that enslaved people face, like malnutrition. Certainly, people are eating dirt, they're likely facing malnutrition. But it makes it seem like a pathology. And interestingly enough, what we can also see from studying the medical journals that Drake edited is that he's deliberately trying to encourage this type of research. So Drake is in his kind of men of many hats or man of many hats aspect, as I said earlier. Well, he he edits the Western and Southern Medical Recorder. Then also it's different times it's called the Western Journal of Medical and Physical Sciences. But he wrote in 1828 an address to the physicians of the West. And this also tells you about how great medical journals are as a source. That he solicited articles on the quote comparative histories of the diseases of the Negroes and whites, end quote. And likewise that year, the journal offered up a $50 prize for the best dissertation on quote the general principles of the pathology and treatment of the diseases of the Negroes of the Southern states, with a particular application of them to the malady generally denominated Negro consumption, which is another descriptor of Cachexia africana, going back to Drake now. Reference being constantly had to the constitutions and diseases of the whites of the same regions as standards of comparison, end quote. So Drake is also trying to encourage students to write their theses on these topics. So while in some cases these theses are after Drake has already left for Louisville, it's a very interesting kind of dynamic of, are these students responding to the call that he's putting in medical journals? So yeah, it's really for my sources, combination of these interesting correspondence networks, also where you can learn about Drake's views on race, these student writings, medical journals, and then their own kind of voluminous works on race. Drake wrote a 2-volume history of the diseases of different racial groups in the West. Actually, it ends up mostly being about whites, but that's more than 2,000 pages. So prolific writer himself.
Yeah, that was when you were going through in the articles that long sort of list of, there were a couple of footnotes where you were going through some of those dissertations. You could tell a lot of them did not sound very exciting, and they all seemed, just from an outside, they all seemed to have the same title, where it was just like, oh, this sounds exactly what the other person was just doing here.
Yep, that was my life for about 10 months of like 40 hours a week was reading those. But I guess what the kind of key was to not get so bored that you might actually glaze over and miss something, because every once in a while there are, there's a kind of mundane, interesting things that happen, and then these kind of truly horrifying things you might come across. I found examples of students experimenting on enslaved people in South Carolina in my book, and so it's every once in a while, it's like searching for needles in haystacks. But every once in a while, there'd be something kind of truly disturbing in that case, or stunning work of originality. But then for most times, it's just, yeah, powering through very derivative, very boring theses on cholera, malaria, yellow fever, etc.
There also seemed to be a lot of kissing up to professors at that time. There seemed to be quite a bit.
Yes.
I guess flattery worked back then as well. So citing your advisor might not be the worst thing. But that does lead me to sort of the question to bring this all together. From the opening of Kentucky's first medical school in 1819 to the deaths of Drake and Caldwell in 1852 and 1853, you write this in your conclusion. These men emerged as two of the most important medical professors and commentators on race. I know this is a broad question, so you don't have to go into too great detail, but can you explain a little bit why Drake and Caldwell were pivotal to the development of racial science in the United States. And I know you touched on this with the dissertations and some of the things, but how did their ideas spread so that they're not just writing for Transylvania or Louisville or in Cincinnati, that they're really spreading out throughout the US?
That's a really great question. And so Drake and Caldwell, their Eastern connections are deep. That go back to their medical education, but also as these kind of founding figures, like, you would see literally them described, and this is paraphrasing, but it's close to an exact quote, the chief medical men of the West, Charles Caldwell, Daniel Drake. So, there are some other people who might get listed in there as well, but that's how they were seen in their profession. So to somebody like John Collins Warren, who is the third president of the AMA, if I'm not mistaken, or the second or third, he sees Drake as his insights to the West. He also will actually sponsor excavations of mounds for Native American human remains in the West, in Steubenville, Ohio, in one case. And so they're collecting human remains. Horace Holly, who's the president of Transylvania University for some time, and a friend of John Collins Warren, will actually, while staying at a plantation in Clarksville, Tennessee, pretty close to the Kentucky border, will collect Native American remains. So on one hand, they're actually facilitating what's now an increasing problem for museums today, the collection of Native American human remains, in particularly the kind of Mississippian societies of the kind of great mound building societies, most famously Cahokia in Missouri, or that might be in Illinois, but I know it's right in those borders of St. Louis. But additionally, people like Drake and Caldwell provide a set of insights about what's happening on plantations, about everyday experiences of practicing on enslaved people, that somebody like John Collins Warren is much more academic to. To give another example, Louis Agassiz, who is a Harvard professor who becomes the kind of most influential polygenist of the late 1850s. He's internationally famous, he's European, and when he gets to the United States, he is trying very hard to get a hold of, I know this is disturbing, but African Americans' brains, or Afro-Canadians in one case's brains, to compare them. That's not really a problem for somebody like Charles Caldwell, frankly. They're going to be at Transylvania University, where you're in those kind of bluegrass plantation districts. A lot of the quote unquote anatomical material in the dissecting room are people of African descent. A lot of them are also white folks as well, and particularly poor whites, but they're going to have a set of insights on what it's like to live amongst, these are, I would say, false insights, and insights that are, of course, shaded by their own racial bias. Caldwell is a Southerner from North Carolina, but they will transmit these back. They also write these very influential texts. Caldwell in 1830 produces that book I mentioned in favor of polygenesis. It's the first one from an American author. He'll be cited over and over by other physicians. When Samuel Morton, who ends up becoming the kind of, until his death, before Agassiz becomes the leading light of the polygenesis movement, it's Samuel Morton who writes Crania Americana and Crania Aegyptiaca, and who's a Philadelphia physician. He will reach out to Caldwell for an endorsement of his book. So Caldwell becomes famous in that way. He'll also become a critical phrenology lecturer in the Mississippi River Valley. So they get called upon as these kind of speakers of the West in a certain way. They're very keyed into these broader intellectual networks. And then in 1851, I mentioned this, but Drake will write this very influential set of letters in the National Intelligencer on behalf of colonization and on behalf of banning people of African descent from coming to Ohio and other northern states. This is really right after the Compromise of 1850, right after the new fugitive slave laws have been promoted. And he is speaking as a person of kind of, quote unquote, experience with these different racial groups, with their, what he would say, their kind of instincts, their pathology, psychological and physical. So in a lot of ways, these Southerners, these Westerners, and particularly people in states with slavery, end up having a certain authority that comes from their everyday experiences that, for the most part, people in the Northeast didn't have. Somebody like Morton's books are much more academic, whereas Drake will write about, allegedly that enslaved people are having respiratory issues from cotton ginning, which you can imagine, there's fibers
Right.
coming out. And he even says that some planters intentionally have older enslaved people do cotton ginning because it shortens their lifespan. I mean, disturbing fact, but that kind of insight you're not going to see from a Northern physician in the same way. So in that respect as well, on the one hand, they're just like a lot of kind of early settlers. They create the world that they've come to lead in a very meaningful way. And they're also kind of the scions of this Eastern medical elite, and they never leave behind those connections. And as an American medical profession is being built, they're building a regional one, and they become the kind of chief figures in it, and are critical to why the West gets the third meeting of the American Medical Association after Charleston and Philadelphia. No, Charleston's fourth, Boston and Philadelphia. They get it before Charleston, which is often considered a critical scientific city in this period.
Well, I think you make a great case for why we should focus on the West and in that period and the influence that it had on American medicine. But thank you so much for joining us today. I know I've really enjoyed this discussion, and as always, I'll encourage folks to go check out the article. The medical special issue really has so many good articles that they do interlock. You can sort of see some of the same trends. We've got a couple that deal with transy, so it is an interesting. I think it'll be useful to sort of see how these line up together. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. And I'm thrilled to read the special issue article myself. It's a great lineup of authors, so I'm looking forward to it.
The story of medicine and the growth of the medical profession in Kentucky is hardly one of continual progress. Those who sought to understand the human body and its functions in the 19th century often brought with them ingrained prejudices. As Dr. Willoughby explained, these biases were often reinforced at medical institutions scattered throughout the United States, including Transylvania. Understanding these stories helps us better understand the forces that shape the course of medical history. This brings another episode to a close. I would like to thank our guest, Dr. Christopher Willoughby, for talking with me today. Kentucky Chronicles is presented by the Kentucky Historical Society with support from the Kentucky Historical Society Foundation. Our show is produced by Gregory Hardison and edited by Gregory Meyer with support from Dr. Stephanie Lang. Our theme music is used courtesy of Pixabay. To learn more about our publication of The Register or to learn more about our Research Fellows program, please visit our website, history.ky.gov. That's history.ky.gov. If you have enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe. It really helps us to know how we are doing. You can also help us build a following by telling your friends to subscribe.